Hello, Merry Christmas, and welcome back to Road Tripping with Rachel. I'm Rachel, and thank you so much for joining me on this road trip. So we have been working our way through a mini-series that I'm doing here throughout Vlogmas, and we have been working our way through the 12 days of Christmas and some meaning that is behind them. So far, we have learned about the 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. And today we are going to learn about the 5 golden rings. I know you're so excited. I'm ready to get started on this. I was really excited as I was going through and planning this stuff out, and I am ready to go. I have my Mrs. Claus mug, but instead of coffee, which I normally have, today it is peppermint tea. Look at me being all bougie in my Mrs. Claus mug, and my buffalo check scarf. My parents got this for me last year for Christmas. I love it. It's so warm. It's so warm. And December and Christmas, we just need to feel cozy. So, 5 golden rings. All right, just as kind of a refresher and as a reminder here for us, as we have been working through the 12 days of Christmas, it came around during medieval times, where it was meant to help the very illiterate people be able to learn about Christianity, the Bible, and different, what I would guess we could call core tenets of the faith when we're talking about medieval Christianity. So, partridge in a pear tree is Jesus on top of the cross. Super practical gift, a partridge, but also has great significance in it, because here it is a gift that is Jesus Christ, who is in the tree, which is a pear tree, which is very sweet, but he did die on the cross, and then he rose again on the 3rd day. 2 turtle doves, meant to be a gift to people. It used to be a symbol of being poor during Old Testament times. You could offer turtle doves in place of a lamb if you were a poorer family whenever it came time to do sacrifices. But these are representative of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old and New Testament for the Christian is put together with the canon, which was established in the 300s, and canon is a term meaning the measuring rod. So there are specific standards that the New Testament books had to be able to meet in order to be included in that. Now, it is important to note that there are additional books that are part of the Apocrypha. These are intertestamental books that did not meet the requirements either by Jewish scripture or by the Christian standard to be included in the Old or the New Testament, and so they are left out of Protestant Bibles. But if you were to look at a Catholic Bible, you would find them in there. This isn't to say that they aren't useful for reading or for information, but they are not considered to be holy sacred scripture. Then we have 3 French hens. We're talking faith, we're talking hope, we're talking charity. Charity not to be confused with a charity or a charity case, but we are referring to charity is like love and wanting to do well for our fellow man. Think Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. 4 calling birds are meant to be representative of the gospel. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, which are the synoptic gospels, and then the book of John, which is a great work of theology. All of them do give a overview of who Jesus is, both as man and as God, but they are written to different audiences. And although the synoptic gospels, meaning that they follow a pretty linear path, do overlap with some of the events that are in there, they are all also showcasing some different events that all happened during the life and ministry of Jesus. But now we are up to 5 golden rings, and the 5 golden rings are the Pentateuch. So what do I mean when I'm talking about the Pentateuch? Well, for all of you Greek scholars out there and Latin scholars, what does penta mean? 5. It means 5. So the Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible. also known as the law. So, or if you are familiar with Jewish culture, it would be considered Torah. Now, this is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, personally, on a personal note, I actually really enjoy whenever I get the opportunity to hear sermons or to do studies that take place out of Torah or the Pentateuch, because I think they're highly underrated books, especially within the larger Christian conversation. So why are these going to be important? Okay, so we're going to just take each of them just like down the line. So we've got Genesis. What is the importance of Genesis? Genesis covers creation. It covers the days of creation. It covers the creation of man. It covers the fall and how mankind allowed sin to enter, and how now God has implemented his plan to fix our problem. It follows through Noah and the flood. It follows through, then it narrows itself down to the family of Abraham, and then focuses probably 75% of the book of Genesis then focuses in on specifically Abraham's family. So you see Abraham, who's called out of Ur, how he goes into the land of Canaan, him and his wife and all of his servants and all of his flocks, and how he builds wealth for himself there, and how he moves around, how he develops his relationship with God, and then had his son Isaac, how Isaac marries, they struggle with infertility, and eventually how they end up having a set of twins, Jacob and Esau. We start to see a lot of things having to do with family dynamics within the book of Genesis, and then we focus in then on Jacob and Jacob's family life, which is just screwed up, to be perfectly honest, in multiple ways. He is not the example we want to use when we're talking about a healthy family life. And then we segue to focus in on his sons Judah, and then most well known would be his son Joseph. Genesis opens with "in the beginning God," and then it closes with Joseph being dead in a coffin in Egypt. That is a quote that came from my pastor actually this last weekend, and it stuck with me, and so I wanted to share it with you. So great job, Jason at Cornerstone Baptist Church. Now we're going to take a look at Exodus. So Exodus is where we now have the people, the Hebrew people. They came to Egypt with Joseph, under Joseph's time. It's about 400 years later. The book of Exodus opens up, and we see now this family has now actually become this large people group, and with that, we see how this people group eventually forms itself into a cohesive nation. This has to do with Moses. He should be well known to a whole lot of people. So we end up with Moses. We got Aaron. We got Miriam. We've got 10 plagues taking place. I would say a big theme at the opening of Exodus is going to be that God will not be mocked, and that you can have whatever little gods that you want. It doesn't really matter, because God is bigger than them. And to quote VeggieTales, God is bigger than the boogeyman. And so he is going to more or less thumb his nose at some of the Egyptian gods during this time and cause these plagues that eventually culminates in the Hebrew people being released from slavery in Egypt. They cross the Red Sea. There's been a bunch of plays. There's movies on it. Prince of Egypt, one of the best movies I think DreamWorks has ever made. It's got a great scene where the sea splits. It's awesome. And the Hebrew people are then able to cross over the sea into the land of Canaan and continue their travels. Basically, as the story continues, they screw up pretty royally, and they are not able eventually to enter the land. But that is in a different book that we will be covering some of that. It gets reiterated multiple times throughout. Now, Exodus is also very well known because it is where the 10 Commandments are recorded. And a lot of people here, they begin to look at the book of Exodus, and this is where you really start to hear people talk about, the Bible is just a whole lot of rules and regulations and how I can do this, but I can't do that. All I forgot to say is that 19 comes before 20. I had a professor while I was in college, Dr. Mike Hubbard. So shout out Dr. Hubbard. He'll know I was one of his students because only his students will refer to him as Dr. Hubbard. But that was one thing he always said in class whenever I was taking an introductory course into Old Testament, is that always remember 19 comes before 20. And chapter 19 of Exodus tells you why God gave us the 10 commandments, is that I will be your God and you will be my people. And this is how you're going to react to me. You are going to interact with me. And this is going to be how I know that you love me, because you are following these commands that I am giving you. And then Exodus continues on, and we start to see more rules and laws that are not necessarily meant to be judgmental of the heart of the person, but are really meant to dictate how they are to function as a nation. So before you get all judgmental about it, make sure you go through and you read it. Next, we are moving on to the book of Leviticus. So in Leviticus, this is very much meant to talk about the ceremonial laws. So now we have talked about how they're supposed to interact with each other as a nation, but Israel is also set up to be a theocracy, which means God is supposed to be their king, so to speak. Within it, they are not designed to have a king sitting on the throne, although that will eventually happen as you continue reading through scripture. But Leviticus is meant to talk about the ceremonial laws. You see concepts of clean versus unclean, and how the priesthood is meant to function within the nation of Israel. So it talks about who can be priest, what their role is, how they're supposed to be serving the people as a whole. It talks about the tabernacle, which is the holy place that was it was a massive tent. Really, and tent isn't really even a good word. It is more of it was a massive structure that had very specific directions on how it was to be set up, what materials were meant to be used, who could enter, when, what was supposed to take place in there, how things were to be set up, and it was meant to be able to be torn down and moved as the Hebrew people were moving through the wilderness for 40 years, which we hear about more in the book actually of Numbers. But as we continue through, the big theme that comes across in the book of Leviticus is that God is holy. I've said it several times now across my channel whenever I'm talking about lessons and themes, and I keep wanting to bring us back to this idea that God is holy, and we can't make God into our image of something. We have to acknowledge that we are sinful, and that we live in a very sinful world, but that is not who God is. God is holy, and he is at the same time completely separate from us. And for us to be able to recognize that there is evil in the world, that means we have to have some sort of standard, and God is that standard. And so we see all the time that we are not the holy ones. And because we are in a relationship with God, and because the Hebrew people were in a relationship with God, they voluntarily entered into a covenant with him, which is what you really see throughout the book of Exodus, and then how the other books all expound on, is this is how we are going to interact with God, because we are in a relationship with him. I've said it a couple times now through this channel that, you don't put your dirty socks on top of the counter. Once again, that was from seminary. I don't even know who the person was who originally brought it up. I just heard it in Hebrew and Old Testament class, and I've always thought about this, that, that's not a rule that you ever feel like you should have to say to someone, but it's also understood that you don't put dirty socks on top of the counter. And because in that particular scenario, when I was hearing the story about it, was if you love your wife, you won't do this because it's just going to make her mad. She doesn't have to say it's going to make her mad. You just don't do it because it's going to make her mad. In the same way, because God is holy and we are not, we know that there are specific ways that we are supposed to be interacting with him. And the book of Leviticus outlines that. It also really talks about the different types of sacrifices that were being made during this time, which those were outlines that were for a specific time in a specific place with a specific group of people. But the idea was that because we are sinful, because God is holy, there are consequences for our sin. And it was, the cattle and the sheep and the goats and these other creatures that had to face, that were given as a replacement for people, because if we had to sacrifice a person every time that we sinned, that would just be abhorrent to us. The idea that we would be killing another person, or at least it should be. If it's not, please go talk to a counselor, seriously. Then we get into the book of Numbers. So a lot of people find Numbers really boring. I am not a math person at all. I'm an application-based learner. If I can understand how it can be used, I can learn it and I can interact with it and I will be able to apply it, which is why I still remember profit is equal to E times to the power of R times T. I still remember that from my pre-calculus class, because it has to do with money. That is how you can find your profit whenever you are making investments. If it is a long-term investment and it's going to be consistent for your savings account, as long as you never move anything out of it. There you go. That's what I remember from my 11th grade math class. But in Numbers, this is where we get to see a record of the people. And why is this important? If you go through the book of Numbers, you will see very specific numbers, which means that these things were actually tracked. Sometimes as you read throughout scripture, you will see numbers that, that tend to stick out, 70 times 7 in the New Testament. Jesus talks about that's how often we're supposed to be forgiving people. He's not specifically saying you need to forgive someone. What is it? 400 is, I think it works out to 490. Like I said, I'm not great with math. Especially not when I'm on the spot. No, that's ignore that number. Just ignore that number. We're just going to move on. Anyway, it's not saying you specifically have to forgive that person 70 times 7 times. What it means is you forgive them a lot, continuously. Continuously. In specific situations, of course, I know that there are things that might someday be forgiven but never forgotten, and they have to be held accountable for their actions. Not saying that at all, but as an example, that's what this is talking about, that you forgive the people who trespass against you. And I'm continuing to move on with this. So when we see very specific numbers, that means that those are real numbers. They were actually counted. This was a census that happened. They checked to see and to make sure that all the people were accounted for. They checked to see what tribe they were a part of. So Jacob had 12 sons. We see in the book of Genesis, those 12 sons all had kids. And so they all became individual families. Now there's 12 tribes that are within Israel. So they were counting all the different, they primarily would count men and boys that had reached the age of majority, and they were all counted. And then the book of Numbers also accounts for a few events that take place during that time, pretty early on during the, I guess I wouldn't say early on, I would say probably a little bit more, take place when getting out of Egypt was still relatively new. They hadn't been out for that long. They had been out long enough to recognize who were the leaders amongst them, to recognize Moses as their leader, and to have already screwed things up. So it didn't take them that long. Actually, they screwed up a couple of times by the time we even make it to the book of Numbers. But here we see where they send 12 spies into the land of Canaan. 10 of them come back and say, the people are giants, we can't take them on. And then you get the 2 people who come back and say, no, we can do this because God is for us. And the people are like, no, we're going to listen to the other 10. And then God says, okay, none of y'all who voted to do this are going to be able to go in with the exception of these 2. So that all happens in there. And what's really important is that these people that are accounted for, and whenever God gives a name, that's important, because that means that God saw you, and he sees all of us. So whether you are, you are a Christian or a non-believer, God still sees you. And when you get to see names recorded in Scripture, he does that for a purpose. And here we see on a grand scale the purpose of having your family recorded and being able to say, like, yes, I was from this tribe and these are my children, and be able to say, like, because I am from this tribe, this is what my job is. And it was very important to the people that they take pride in who they came from and what family they were a part of and how they were going to be used in this great community that God had planned on making, and that was starting to come to fruition now, and they were able to now see it. So that's Numbers. Then we get into Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is basically just like, if we were to summarize the other 4 books, this is Deuteronomy. So here is the summary. This is what happened in Genesis. This is everything that happens in Exodus. This is everything that, summary of like what Leviticus is about. This is how we all screwed up in the book of Numbers. And then Moses dies at the end of it, after saying like, Joshua will be your new leader. That is Deuteronomy in a nutshell. He hands the people off to Joshua, and then they prepare to go into the land of Canaan. And then it will immediately then open into the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua picks up right where the book of Deuteronomy has left off. It's important because Deuteronomy was one of those books that it was highly encouraged that the people would memorize. And largely because, one, it's a summary, which is super important, but it also, at the very beginning of the book, it keeps hammering home over and over and over again. You need to teach the things that God has done for you and for your people, and how you have seen him do these things. You need to be teaching those to the next generation. There's not really a thing as generational sin, as in, because my great-grandfather did something, I am responsible for that action that a great-grandparent has created. There is generational sin in the fact that because one family member has done this, instead of breaking that cycle, you allow yourself to stay in that cycle. Alcoholism, abuse, those are 2 really heavy issues that I would say would be generational. And in both cases, each successive generation has the ability to say, I'm not going to be that way. And if you choose to remain in that cycle, then you've chosen to remain in that cycle. That is the choice that you have made. It's no one's fault but your own in that case. But here we see the importance of family and how the great influence that not only parents have, but grandparents and aunts and uncles, that as a community of people, we're supposed to be teaching our children and the next generation. These are the things that God has done. This is who he is. These are how we have seen him continuously remain faithful. And now, more than 2,000 years later, probably closer to three and a half, millennia later, we can now, as Christians, be able to look back and say, look at how faithful God has been. I'm able to hear about how faithful God has been with my parents and my grandparents, and how they have been able to share what God has done in their lives. And I have been able to make a decision to become a Christian and to follow Jesus wholeheartedly, because both because I have made that decision, but also because I've had those healthy influences of hearing, but this is what God has done in the past. So there's no reason for me to doubt that he will continue to do good things and that he will fulfill his promises in the future and in the here and now. We talked about faith and we talked about hope previously. Now, I have that hope and I have that faith, and I'm able to love my brothers and my sisters because of the faith and the hope that I have in Jesus, and because I've had that testimony of the people who have gone before me, and to see what God is currently doing and what he has done. So that is our 5 golden rings. This video is starting to get a little long, so I'm going to wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. That really helps out my channel, helps get the information that I am sharing on here out with others. I'm really happy that we got to join each other on this day. I believe it's 10 of Vlogmas. Look at the time fly, but I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.